for making time, and maybe I'll just switch on the video for a couple of seconds and then come back on video during the Q&A if that works out. So I happen to be taking this. Video call from or this webinar from the IIM Bangalore campus, so you can see a bit of the greenery outside, and it's still as beautiful as most of us remember. And actually, we might have forgotten, but it's still very beautiful. So anyway, let me get off the video, and I'll come back on video probably in the Q&A if that's relevant. Let me put it onto full screen so that it'll make it easier. Okay, so someone had a question which they addressed to the alumni office about whether this is about corporate financial planning or personal financial planning or at the individual level. It's at the individual level. So as this cartoon reflects, there's some truth about this for all of us. And I don't mean just people who are, I'm including people like myself. Just 1 second, there's some message about being not audible. 1 second. Just requesting either Ankita or Sushma to confirm that they can hear me on the chat. Okay, let me carry on. So as I said, this is true for all of us, including myself. So in some cases, it could be that we don't know exactly what we should be doing on financial planning and investing. In some cases, it could be that we know, but it's just hard to implement. So just like doctors also smoke, though they know they should not be smoking. Similarly, even, I know things in my own life where I know I should be fixing them, but I'm not doing them with enough seriousness. So why bother with financial planning? I've listed a few points there. I'll give you a couple of seconds. They're fairly obvious. The last one is, also obvious, but essentially we all have a responsibility to our future selves to kind of trade off today versus tomorrow in an appropriate manner. So you can actually think of this in two ways. The positive way to think of it is that, a secure financial life or money is a necessary but not sufficient condition for other kinds of freedom in life. So as Benjamin Franklin said, it's hard for an empty sack to stand upright. So without money, it's kind of hard to do many other things in life, or even lead a life of integrity in various ways. So that's how important it is. You could also think of it in the negative way. So Charlie Munger gave a framework on how to address a question, and one of that framework was saying invert something to see how to go about it. So if you invert, you see that if you wanted to mess up a person's life, there are many ways to do it. But one way is to just create, to have financial problems, or if you have financial problems, severe financial problems, it's rather difficult to be happy. So inverting that, it's one of the things that one needs to fix to ensure that there's a chance of a happy life. Let me move on. As I mentioned in the introductory email, I'm focusing on the question of retirement planning because that's inevitable for all of us. Essentially, we will all face a point in life where we are unemployed I mean, we are forced to be unemployed. We won't have a choice. So this is an important enough problem, and William Sharpe actually is still spending the rest of his late part of his life trying to address this problem in a mathematical sense and in a practical sense. And that's why the focus on the financial planning session is on retirement planning. Moving on, these are just a few questions that I've put together that I thought would be relevant for most of us. So I'll go through each of these questions one by one. It's possible it might be a little fast for some people or a little slow for some people, but let me go on and request either Sushma or Ankita to let me know at any point if there's a technology problem and they cannot hear me, but I'll carry on till then. So the first question on that list is, how much should I save for retirement? And I think this is probably the most important question in this whole presentation. So let me go through this in a little more detail and cut some corners on the other stuff. Jumping straight to the answer in my view is, are there many people who are facing difficulty hearing? Just give me 1 second. Let me just, sorry about this distraction. Okay, I'll just carry on till either Ankita or Sushma. Okay, thank you for someone confirmed. Thank you so much. So the answer, just the simple answer is, one needs a net worth which is equal to 30 years of your current expenses. That's the answer. The nuances, let me come to that, because that's, and when I'm expenses, I mean current expenses. So for example, if your current expenses for the year, just for example, are 10 lakh rupees a year, then, and you're 60 years old, 10 lakhs is your current expenses as a couple. 10 lakhs multiplied by 30 years is equal to 3 crore rupees. That's the number that you need to have in terms of total net worth. That's the kind of simple answer to this question. The nuances are as follows. The most simple case is, if you just mathematically, the most simple case is if you live in a rental accommodation, you don't own any real estate. It's not a recommendation not to own real estate, it's just a mathematical point that if you don't own any real estate, you live in a rental house or apartment. It's very simple because your expenses are known to you. You know that you spend 10 lakhs a year, which is including rent. 10 lakhs multiplied by 30 is equal to 3 crores, and it's as simple as that, because your expenses of 10 lakhs include your rental expense. So that's a very simple mathematical case. The other very common case, which is more mathematically complex, is if you own your own residence. That's mathematically a little more complex, so the answer here is a bit of an approximation. And I'll come back to justify some of these points, at least to some extent, but let me just give you the answer first. If you own your own residence, it's mathematically a little more complex, but the approximate answer I have suggested is that you need a net worth, excluding that residence that you live in, because you can't rent it out. That needs to be, you need to have 30 times that. Okay, so let me just give you a kind of trivial example. So supposing 8 lakhs is what the same person spent because they had a house and they don't have to spend on rent, just as an example. 8 lakhs per annum multiplied by 30 is equal to 2.4 crores is what such a person has to have apart from the residence that they own. And this is an approximation. The last case, I won't read it out. This webinar, the recording of the webinar is available through the IIM Bangalore alumni site, so you don't have to take notes and you can come back to this. For example, the third point here is a slightly complicated point, so I won't go into that. It just deals with a case where someone owns a residence but doesn't live in it. But I think that's an unlikely case, so let's park that and we'll move on. And you can always come back to this webinar, to look through the recording. And for that reason, you also don't really have to take notes. I mentioned I'll explain a little bit of my rationale, and there's two bits of it really. One, I have assumed, so this is an assumption, that an individual will earn zero post-tax real returns over their lifetime. There are several nuances of this, so I won't go into all of them. But essentially, real returns means in nominal returns that we talk of in day-to-day life. The fixed deposit gives me 7% interest. That is nominal returns. Minus inflation is real returns, and I'm specifically talking about it post-tax. I'm talking about it on the entire portfolio. So you have some equity which earns higher returns, but some stuff which earns lower returns. Your safe investments will typically earn on the average lower returns, and one might have a higher equity allocation when one is younger, but that will reduce over one's lifespan. So the returns that you're getting right now, say in your 30s, 40s, 50s, may not be what you will get in your 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. And there's an article that I've written that details this out a little more. In general, I'll be referring to a few articles, and they're available on my website on this tab which I've mentioned here on this link. So I'll just mention the article name, and the link is on the website and it's mentioned here. So key assumption number one is zero post-tax real returns. Someone might say this is very conservative. I don't think so, but yeah, compared to what most people will tell you, yes, it's on the very conservative end of things. But I believe that it's not really conservative. It's fairly normal and sensible. Moving on, the second key assumption is there are lots of nuances about how long one will live, but essentially I've said plan if you are 60 to live till 90. That's actually far beyond the average, what the average person will live. But there are certain nuances to it which makes it a sensible assumption, and this particular article mentioned here covers some of those assumptions. So basically, if I mentioned, for example, if you're 60 years old, a man might live till 80, a woman might live till 83. We as people on this webinar are a little more affluent than the average Indian, so our lifespan is a little longer, etc., etc. So in simplicity, plan for 30 years. So those are the two key assumptions, and I answered the question of what do you need to have if you are 60. But for most of us on this call, we are not 60, and we are somewhere before that. So what do you need to have or save? Either have a stock of savings or annual savings before that. So take an example of someone who's 45 years old, and essentially I've recommended that someone like this should, and I'll get to the logic of it, someone like this should have 15 years of expenses as savings. So by the same logic, where assuming you spend 10 lakhs a year is what you spend, and you may say you means who you, including your children, we'll come to that. But broadly, if 10 lakhs is what you spend, and yes, 10 lakhs is what your entire household expense is, broadly, and I'll come to the caveats, then you need to have 10 multiplied by 15, that is 1.5 crores ideally of savings already. I know that's a very tough ask for most of us and all of us, but I'm just laying out what I think makes sense. Naturally, it is a tough ask, and there are maybe some workarounds, etc. So to generalize this, actually, if basically if you're 30 years old, if you're 31 years old, you should have 1 year of savings, 1 year of expenses and savings. If you're 35, you need to have 5. If you're 40, you need to have 10. That's what I'm saying. The clock essentially starts at least by the age of 30. So if you're 50, you need to have 20 years of expenses and savings, and 55, you need to have 25, and so on. There are some nuances mentioned here about for people who have EMIs, etc. But I won't go into this. You could read the nuances, and the webinar is available, as I said, recorded. In simplicity, anyway, let me move on anyway. That was what I mentioned for someone who's 45 years old was a specific example, and here I'm just putting out a formula for why what's the logic for that statement. So the logic for the statement, sorry, let me just rewind one bit, sorry about that. I think I mentioned here that such a person would have to be saving about 50% of their post-tax income. That also is a fairly tough ask, and it is and the subsequent slides talk of my rationale for that number and for this overall requirement. So what's the annual saving that I said of a 45-year-old or pretty much any year old 50-year-old under normal circumstances should be saving 50% of what they earn post-tax income. What's the logic for this? This is the kind of formula that I'm using to justify it. It's a lot of assumptions in it, but this is the justification. Some of it is very first principles, like essentially, essentially what it's saying is that the first part of this formula is that it says annual expenses multiplied by 30 is what's the corpus that you need minus the current net worth that you have dedicated for retirement, available for retirement. So for example, it's possible that some part of your corpus is for higher education for children in India or abroad, so that's really not available for retirement. So the corpus is available for retirement is already covered. The rest is what you need to cover, so that's the numerator. Divided by the remaining number of years till the age of 60 is what you need to be saving as a rupee lakh number every year. So that will throw up a rupee lakh number that you need to save every year. You will have several questions in your mind at this point, but I'll come to this, a few of those questions at least, and those nuances in subsequent slides. Why 60 years, why various things, and I'll come to those. So just to reiterate, the left hand side of the numerator is how much you need to have. The right hand side of it is the amount you've already collected out of it or you've saved out of it. So the difference between the two is the gap that still needs to be filled. Dividing it by the remaining number of years till 60. So if you're 50, then there are 10 years remaining, is the amount you need to be saving each year. I'll just take a couple of, I'll just make it, and this explains why the specialized case of someone at 45 turns out the way I explained. So for example, if your annual expenses, just plugged in a variable called Z, is Z, so you need Z multiplied by 30, which is the total corpus you'll need. And given that I'm assuming zero real returns, I'm basically able to ignore returns, inflation, all of that in this simplified model. Minus this person who saved 15 years of expenses, so he needs 30Z, he's got 15Z already, so the gap is 15Z. Divided by 15 more years to go, so 1Z, so that is 1 year's expenses is what he needs to save each year. So you need to save 1 times Z, you need to spend 1 times Z to cover your lifestyle today. So basically you need to save 50% of your post-tax income is broadly what you come to in this case. Let's take another case of someone who's at 45 and just like in a cricket match, his early savings have not been in line with this required run rate, and so he's a little behind schedule, not too bad, but he's got 10 years of savings, not too bad, pretty good actually. So you just plug in the same numbers in this formula and you get 30Z multiplied minus 10Z, so 20Z in the numerator divided by 15 is equal to 1.33Z. So what this means is he needs to save 1.33Z, he needs to spend 1 times Z, because that's the definition of what Z is, that is your annual expense. So effectively he needs to save 57% of his post-tax income, which is even worse and more painful obviously than saving 50%, which is already painful. So it's just like in cricket. So if you're not in line with the required run rate, you will have to make up for it later. That's essentially the maths of it. So let me come to all those caveats that let me also come to all those caveats and questions that you probably have, and I'll try to address a few of them at least. I'll run through these quickly. The first is currently I'm spending more because of education expenses for my children. I won't read out the numbers. So point number 1, yes, but apart from higher education expenses which are very lumpy and very large for kids, I think otherwise one should just treat expenses as expenses. Today you have these expenses, tomorrow you'll have more healthcare expenses. So I think this is it's better to be approximately correct than precisely wrong. So I think this is a good approximation of correctness. Yes, you can take it with a pinch of salt, and maybe there are special cases where it's different, but broadly this will give you a guideline. Second point, yes, but careers are very unpredictable, and increments just might be in line with inflation, and this model already assumes that you'll get increments in line with inflation, which may not be true in your 50s, etc., etc. Point number 3, you may hope that you will retire at 65, 70, but it's a function of, or you may never retire, you may hope, but it's actually a function of health. So really, none of us control that. Point number 4, very common view. There isn't really any data to really suggest it very accurately. There are some data here and there, but broadly there's some pattern, but broadly I think it's a fair assumption to assume that you'll spend a similar amount. You'll just be spending on different things. You'll be spending much more on healthcare, and you'll be spending less on kids' education and some other things maybe. Point number 5, yes. I don't have any other answer to that. Point number 6, there is, I mean, one really can't escape this problem, because if your focus is just on your kids, you will one day become a liability for them. So it's money is fungible. If you to the extent, yes, you could choose to invest in the education, that's a good investment, but yeah, and if you don't save enough for yourself, they will have to take care of you. So it's just I mean, there's no free lunch there. There's something called the 4% withdrawal rule, but I'll come to it later, which people keep quoting, and I'll talk about it later in this presentation. Point number 8, I think it's a bit of which risk do you want to live, I mean, take more of. Do you want to take the risk of missing out on life right now, or the risk of not having enough? So it's a personal choice, and it's a tough choice, and it's not a trivial choice. It is a very valid choice and very sensible, valid question, but it's also a very personal question. I've parked several nuances because they kind of complicate the situation, and I didn't want to take it up on this webinar. Many of these are very relevant, but I've just parked them because I mean, there are other things to complete on this webinar also. But I think the first one mentioned there is very important, that if you and your spouse is a primary breadwinner, the spouse is much younger, etc., one needs to factor that into this equation, and the equation currently does not automatically factor it. It's easy to factor it in. Essentially, you need to factor in 30 years of retirement for the younger spouse, and you need to calculate the number of years remaining to earn for the primary breadwinner. So that's all that you need to adjust in the formula. If we get time, maybe I'll try to answer some questions at the end, and maybe if any of these are very critical, I'll try to cover them. So the question that came up was, 50%, saving 50%, even if you're on track on your required run rate, in a sense, is fairly steep. I guess someone who's on track might be already by nature someone who's saving 50%, but still, anyway, it is a very tough ask or tough requirement. So can you hack this formula really? And the answers are not really, but there are a few things you can do. Obviously, you can cut down annual expenses, but that's a no-brainer. You don't need anyone to say that. But there are probably some variables that people always think of their residence as an investment, but a very luxurious residence is also a form of consumption. So there's some hidden consumption in all our lives, and that's a variable that one can tackle. The right hand side of the numerator is what's available for retirement, and there may be some variables, not very nice ones, but basically not being as sweet to one's kids as one would like to, for example, and not covering the undergraduate education or master's education or graduate education abroad and letting them cover it through a loan. I mean that doesn't solve any problem, but it's just variables essentially. And lastly, I strongly recommend that you assume in your calculations that you're going to retire at 60, especially if that's far away, unless you're already like 58, 59, then and you have better visibility, because it's a conservative assumption. When you actually get closer to 60, then I would say, yeah, try to extend that point in time of retirement if you need to, subject to health, but don't make that assumption right away. That's a very aggressive assumption and a risky assumption. But maybe when you're 59, 60, at that point you could probably make that decision to kind of extend at least partially extend your working life. So that essentially covers the first question of how much should I save. I know the answers aren't very happy, partially because the numbers actually are scary, and partially because I'm being on the spectrum of what people will tell you. I'm being a little conservative. I don't think I'm being, but on the spectrum of what people will say, my views are a little conservative, and hence the numbers seem a little higher than what someone else would suggest. The next question is, how much can I spend during retirement? That's a bit of a corollary to the first question. Very similar logic. The simple answer is when you're 60, the first year of your retirement, let's say you retire at 60, and you're that happy person who can retire at 60, you spend 1/30th of your net worth. Naturally, I'm assuming a simple case of a person who's living in a rental house, etc., etc. So that's the kind of simple base case I'm looking at. You can spend 1/30th of your net worth in the first year. The rationale is very similar, that you can spend your current net worth divided by your remaining life till the age of 90. So for example, if you have 3 crores of net worth and you are 60, you have 30 years remaining, you can spend 10 lakhs a year if you are 60 today. So essentially that's, I've just plugged in more, instead of using rupee lakh numbers, I've plugged in a variable Z. Let's assume your annual expenses at the age of 60 is Z as for a couple. You have 30 times Z as your net worth, and you live in a rental apartment. That's the assumption right through, let's assume. You can spend 1 times Z. So that's the same number of, if you have 3 crores, you can spend 10 lakhs. This is different from what the 4% rule, I mean, a common thing called the 4% rule. It's not a rule, it's just a view or an opinion out there, which says that you can spend 1.2 Z. Broadly, people who think like me don't believe the 4% rule, and for various reasons, and I'll explain a couple more reasons. So basically, I'm saying you can spend 1 times Z. That rule is saying you can spend 1.2 times Z, but that's not the only difference. Yeah, so at every point in time, I'm talking about current. I think someone had a question. At every point in time, I'm talking about current expenses. So just because I've assumed the 0 real returns, at every point in time, I'm talking of current expenses, and that's the easy way to think of things, because the human mind really can't think through expenses 20 years from now. That's not how our minds are built. I mean, those numbers are just so we can't relate to them. So just, I think, always think in terms of current expenses and do all calculations in real terms. You can additionally do the calculation in nominal terms as an extra sanity check, but make sure every calculation is done in real terms, because that's the only one that your mind can relate to. So Z is, as a person stands at the age of 60, his expenses are Z. This is a different Z probably from the previous slides, but it's just the Z at that point in time, the expenses at that point in time. Now let's say the next year you move forward a year. The same couple, right at the beginning of year 1, that is at the age of 60, they withdrew 1 time Z from their kitty and kept it in a different account to spend it. They had 29 Z remaining. Due to investments, the 29 Z kept pace with inflation. So it's still, as at the end of 1 year later, it's still 29 Z, because it kept pace with inflation with 0 real returns. Now what they have is they have 29 years ahead of them, and they have 29 times their expenses in net worth. This may not be completely intuitive right now, but broadly that's how the maths works. They had 29 Z 1 year back. It grew to, the Z grew, but the corpus also grew. They still have 29 Z, and they have 29 years remaining. 29 divided by 29 is basically 1 times Z. They still can spend 1 times current expenses, inflation adjusted expenses. So just to give you that example, if it was 10 lakhs in the first year, and inflation is, just for simplicity, let's say 6%, then they can spend 10.6 lakhs in the second year. So probably that's what I'm trying to say. Again, the 4% rule will say 1.2 times Z, but that, as I already said, my view is different. And now we'll come to why my view is even more different. So, and this is the base case where everything is going as expected and going well and normal and all of that. Let's take a slightly more stress test scenario. This is a more of a stress test scenario where there's a stock market crash. You had 20% of your net worth in equity. The market crashed 50%, fairly large crash of the order of magnitude that happened back in 2008-9 cannot be ruled out, but not like, I mean, not common, but cannot be ruled out and could happen at some point. So luckily you have only 20% of your net worth in equity, so your net worth, that 20% fell to half, so your net worth fell 10%. Essentially, normally you would have had 29Z at that point, but because the market crashed and your net worth fell 10%, you have 10% less. You have 26Z, but you still have 29 years to go. So you can only spend, if you divide these numbers, you can spend 0.9Z. So 90% of what would be your normal expenses in the year. The natural view would be that, yeah, but how do I cut down expenses by 10%? But that's essentially, this is one of the insights that this is essentially one of the insights that William Sharpe provided, and I won't go into why over here. But essentially, the difference is that, the point being that it is a variable number that you can spend. And the 4% rule will say that you can still spend 1.2Z irrespective of what the market does, but that's wrong, and you should be spending only 0.9Z, which is a significantly different number from 1.2Z, a radically different number really. If and when the market bounces back, yeah, increase your spending again, but you basically have to mimic the pattern that your net worth follows, and hence also you can't have very much in equity. So that was about how much you can spend during retirement. Naturally, our expenses aren't very compressible, so reducing it to 90% of what it was last year, or 0.9x, is tough, but that's essentially the way it has to be done, and hence also that constrains how much one can have in equity, especially if one is retired, etc. How should I invest this money? At least I can tell you, firstly, let me start with how you should not invest that money. The most important decision you need to make is on your asset allocation, that is how much of your assets are in risky investments. There's a common rule of thumb called 100 minus age gives you the amount you can put in equity. It could accidentally be correct sometimes, but I don't agree with that rule. I don't like it. It's not bad, but it has some issues, and one issue, I don't like it, but for various reasons I'll tell you, I'll point to my answers. But I think a better way to look at this question really is that one should be talking about risky assets which are both equity and real estate. So this formula is typically used to say that you can put 100 minus your age. So if your age is 60, you can put 40% in equity. So 100 minus 60 is equal to 40. You can put 40% in 40% in equity, independent of whether you have real estate or not, etc. I think that's not really. I think it's a risky way to go about it, and not a precise enough way to go about it. I'm not actually going on this presentation. I'm not really going into my views on what that proportion should be. There's an article I'm pointing to here where I've covered that question. I've specifically covered that question. So let me just read off the first couple of points because it's a little confusing. Essentially, if one was in the US and one is 60 years old, one or even otherwise, one has more products available to mitigate inflation as a risk, and hence one's allocation to risky investments should be the minimum of these three parameters: the need, capacity, and temperament for risk, which is possible in the US, not possible in India because we don't have such instruments. So you need to do some jugaad-like solution of saying, okay, my need for risk is X, my capacity for risk is Y, my temperament for risk is Z. And I'm not getting into explaining each of these here, but often this will throw up a number lower than that 100 minus age formula. Specifically in this article, I've dealt with a retired couple where they came up with an answer like they need to have 20% in equity and they don't have any real estate. Very similar to the case you saw before where there was a stock market crash, their net worth fell by 10%. So very similar kind of situation. For a couple that's younger, there's a certain invisible human capital asset which could be often safe but slightly risky, and that complicates the maths, and I haven't dealt with that in the article, and I'm not dealing with that over here also because it's a little more complicated. But the summary being, think a little harder about it. I'll come to the points on this further in the next slide. This is a very quick way I would go about, I'm just as a concept saying that you could allocate those investments. It varies with age. This is a completely oversimplified illustration. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's just illustrating a few points. Point number one is that the rows indicate various asset classes. I have specifically spoken about products that are low cost products, and that's my style. I like low cost products because costs make a huge difference over time. What looks like a small cost in 1 year, when cumulated, not even compounded, just cumulated over 20, 30, 40 years, becomes a staggering amount of money. And I've covered that in other articles. I won't mention that here, but essentially, I mean, that's the reason for this headline, that focus on products that cost less than 20 basis points per annum. I know some of these products don't really have a cost attached to them. For example, residential real estate, you really cannot allocate a cost to manage it, or there isn't anything like that for fixed deposits. But to the extent that you're using mutual funds, anything of that kind, think of products that cost less than 20 basis points. This percentage split across the age is just a just an illustration. It really isn't meant to be what I'm recommending for any particular person. It's meant to illustrate the point that often we can take less risks than we think we can, or we should take less risks than we think we can, and that risk will reduce. Our allocation to risky assets will reduce with age. What we can do at 40, we can't do at 60 and 80. I'm also using conventional terminology of risky and safe assets, but there is a debate on whether that's a valid terminology, because what could seem risky in a short term could be safe over the long term. But I think broadly, let's look at this terminology of risky in the short to medium term. And so I mentioned various mutual fund products which are index or index-like, and something called direct plans, because those save fees of, costs of the investor. And as I said, even these tiny costs accumulated over 20, 30, 40 years are gigantic. So to give you one example, if you put 1 crore in, and you took that 1 crore out 20 years later, in just 1% difference in cost that you spend would mean that instead of having 1 crore at the end of the 20 years, you might have 83 lakhs only at the end of the 20 years. So it makes that bigger difference. If you're already retired or close to that, life annuities have some relevance. They are highly inefficient products in India. They don't keep pace with inflation, and they are terribly tax inefficient, but you might be forced to put some of your money in it. I've covered this in an article, so I won't go into it in more detail here. This just summarizes some of the rules that I've used to put together, that are kind of flowing through some of these points. I'll run through them quickly. The golden rule, as William Sharpe put it, was diversify and keep costs low. Seems obvious, seems almost stupid, seems there's no rocket science to it, yes, but it's just hard enough to do, and hard enough to make oneself do. And probably the number one rule on this list, and I've actually tried to list them in order that I think they're important. And the first is the most important, which is investing is about minimizing mistakes. Unforced errors is a tennis terminology of sorts, where like a double fault in tennis is an unforced error, where the opponent did not make you lose a point. It's your own mistake that made you lose that point. So just minimizing mistakes and errors is the most fundamental rule of investing. I'll just give you a few seconds to kind of read through the rest, and I'll just see if I need to elaborate on any of the other points. Point number 3 sounds like a bit of a cliche, but probably difficult to elaborate on this short webinar. But I think on every investment, it's good to think about what are the risks involved, and there are a lot of hidden risks in every investment. Even a liquid fund with a certain mutual fund has risks in it, so one should think of that. The point number 6 is probably worth elaborating on, is that if you want to take risk, take equity risk through equity allocation or whatever allocation. Don't take hidden risk through, corporate bonds, which are quasi equity, quasi debt. I mean, you can do that, but it just confuses you and will make you less sure of what exactly your risky asset allocation is. Number 7, avoid opaque products, is because opaque products are largely just meant to confuse and confuse customers or investors. So I think someone asked a question. I just saw a snippet of it because it's in full screen mode. So sorry, I can't read all the questions. So I just saw a snippet of one. I think one that I mentioned in an article of a mistake, a very common mistake, is taking too much, is not diversifying. So as I said, a 60-year-old who has, I've mentioned somewhere, that who has 20% invested, 20% of their net worth invested in one risky real estate investment. Unlikely that a 60-year-old would do it, but one could say, I don't have enough savings, I need to take more risk to make money. Actually, that's completely wrong. If you have less money, you need to take less risk. But let's say it's a very common human tendency to say that I have less money, I need to take more risk to make up for it, which is completely upside down. But if someone had 20% in a risky real estate investment at the age of 60, that's a critical error of not enough diversification. And point number 8 is that we have, so I think someone asked about the PPT. I think the webinar will be available with the voiceover, which probably explains a lot of it. And some of these points won't make sense without the voiceover, so that's why I think that's probably the best way to share it. But anyway, we can discuss that in the Q&A. So I think, yeah, point number 8 is that we all have limited cognitive ability on how much of complexity we can handle. The limitation on how good an investor or how good the investments that you can make are is your own brain as a limitation, not your advisor, not all of that. It's your own brain which is the limit actually on it. So complexity just is clogging it, and one needs to reduce complexity to improve outcomes. Moving on, I think some of these are, I don't think need be much disputing. Point number 1, one should look at very large periods of time of returns, not 5, 10, 15, 20 years, which are irrelevant. Look at 100 years, etc. You don't have the data for India, so try to look at long periods of time to see what actually things are. Point number 2, yes, someone might be able to beat the market, and that might help you, but it's hard to find such managers. I've covered this in an article, so the article mentioned here. Warren Buffett himself says that he would put 90% of his, instructed that 90% of his money that goes to his spouse should go into index funds. So if it's good enough for Warren Buffett, hopefully it's good enough for you. And I don't think we should be doubting that we're smarter than, we shouldn't be assuming we're smarter than Warren Buffett. The last point is a tough question. The short answer is there's no silver bullet. There are many small tiny bullets. They're not exciting, and many of those have been covered already, which is like minimize mistakes, save more, don't waste money on taxes, etc. There are many tiny, almost stupid sounding things, but there is no silver bullet, and you have to actually rely on these tiny, probably 8 such small tiny bullets that I can think of, each contributing about 25 basis points, or a basis point is basically 1/100th of a percentage point. So 25 basis points is basically 0.25%. So each of these bullets contributing, say, 25 basis points, together contributing about 2% to your returns. And I don't mean this as returns. These could also be things like retiring later, which are not investment related. Yeah, someone asked. I think this recording is available on the IIM alumni, Bangalore alumni website, and it's, I think, usually recorded. The last question on the list. Sorry, we're running a little behind schedule. I wanted to wrap up earlier. We'll keep some time for questions at the end. What else is essential? Just wrapping up loose ends. Term life insurance, obviously important. Don't mix insurance and investments. That's 101. Everyone knows it, I think. Health insurance, yes. A difficult document or draft, but important. I've mentioned in gray that disability and critical illness insurance in India is, if you want to take it, take it. If you don't want to take it, don't take it. It's very hard to say. There aren't really very useful products in India, so and I've mentioned it in an article. Unfortunately, it's a very important risk, but unfortunately very difficult to mitigate in India. I mean, the products exist, but they don't really cover very much. This is just a kind of add-on point. Someone had a question. Give me a second. Okay, I don't know what the question was about. I'll come back to it later. Moving on. Sorry, I think just about critical illness and disability. Just since I made a fairly non-standard point, just to give you an absurd example, the article says that if you lose 99% of vision in each eye, the insurance company will say that you're not lost your vision, though you have only 1% vision in each eye. I know it's a very random, absurd example, but essentially that's how all the products are drafted to protect, for valid reasons, to protect the insurance company, and hence the premiums are low, and hence this risk cannot really be mitigated in India through products, through financial products. The example is the point of this slide is that if you probably one of the best investment options that exists is just prepaying a home loan. I won't go into why on this webinar, but it's hard to find better investment options on a risk-adjusted basis. If you really have to compare it with other zero-risk options. The point here being that don't trust completely your intuition. Your intuition is very important, but run the spreadsheet and you'll see that despite all the tax advantages, prepaying a home loan, if you have surplus liquidity, naturally you can't drain all your liquidity, but if you have surplus liquidity, it's probably one of the best risk-adjusted investments that exists, and it more than compensates for the tax benefits on having a home loan. So this was an exercise for someone who's fairly new to financial planning and all of this. Probably obvious to someone who knows the details. This was something for someone who, if you've read 100 books, this is a relevant point to you. If you read 100 books on investing in financial planning, then this may be relevant. So the first was the risk of stocks in the long run. It's an interesting topic worth researching for, reading about further. There's a general common prevalent view that over the long term, if you held stocks for 20 years, it will always beat inflation, or if you held it for 30 years, it will always beat inflation. There are caveats to that. The probability is not 100%. The probability, say, I'm not quoting an exact number, but I'm saying the probability is, say, 80% that in 20 years it will beat inflation, but it's not 100%. And how do you deal with that? And the last is that the limits on our investing is actually our own mind, and as we get older, can we be sure that we will be as sharp when we're 80, etc. And that's a complex intellectual and tough financial planning question. Moving on, just wrapping up. This is probably the median age that where we are at right now. Most of us will be about Dravid's age. Yeah, I think someone asked a question about number of dependents. I'll come to it in the Q&A, but essentially it could change the number formulas a little bit, but I think you'll have far more expenses on medical expenses later. So, and that will be that's a real googly, which can be any number. So I think it can move the needle a bit, but just that you won't have your kids living with you, or you won't have your parents dependent on you, will change the numbers a little bit, but you can rework the numbers, but the broad concepts will stay the same. So coming back to, all of us are our own Dravids, but maybe, for many of us, a key accomplishment was, this IQ test that we wrote somewhere around the age of 22, answering questions of this kind. So we didn't do as much as Dravid did, but anyway, we see ourselves a bit like, in our own mind's eye at least, Dravid. And I think the point of this is that it's very hard to have empathy for our future selves, and this exercise is really that I haven't actually got around to doing this exercise myself, but just doing it with Dravid's photo. If you take this and convert him to some number of years later, this is what he looks like, and what if you did this with your photo, this is what you would look like, say, 20 years later. It's very hard to have empathy for yourself, for the future you 20 years later, but I think just like the 22-year-old who did those exams, kind of did the right thing for you today, I think you have the responsibility to do the right thing for the future you 20 years later. That's it. I'll take a few questions, and I'm sorry there are probably a lot of questions. I'll just try to read through them and see that if I can answer. I think someone asked, I'm not going in sequence, sorry, I'm just probably randomly trying to answer a few questions. One question was the number of dependents before and after retirement. Yes, it does influence the calculation, but I think it influences much less than most people think. As I said, it's better to be approximately correct than precisely wrong. It's easy to be precisely wrong, and one has to be careful with the calculation. One can make overly optimistic assumptions. I mean, a 40-year-old hardly spends on healthcare, but a 70-year-old will, and medical insurance will not cover all of it really. Yeah, the question about Warren Buffett's suggestion applying to India, it's a question that I'm often asked. The data on India shows that the Indian market is very efficient. The data is not. The S&P puts out a report called SPIVA, S&P Index versus Active, every 6 months. The new report came out a few days back. Look at it. Just one second. Just want to check and request to Ankita, Sushma, if you cannot hear me, to let me know. So the SPIVA report for India shows that effectively there's zero alpha generated by the mutual fund industry as a whole, the equity mutual fund industry as a whole. And this has been the story for the last 10 years. It's nothing new. It's not the commonly held view. The commonly held view is that it's easy to earn alpha in India, but that's wrong. I agree that my view is a fairly not the common view. It's the minority view, but that's what the data shows. So sometimes if someone tells you that it's easy to earn alpha in India, ask for the data. The data can't be just one fund or 3 funds beat the index. Obviously some funds will beat the index, and it's possible that a few good managers could beat the index. The tricky part is identifying them in advance, and index funds are fairly cheap in India. The cost of index funds of the Nifty 50 are 11 basis points, that's 0.11%, somewhere between 11 basis points, that's 0.11% and 0.15%. So they're extremely cheap. They're extremely effective. They cover 63% of the free float market cap of the NSE Nifty index. So effectively they cover the entire Indian market for all practical purposes, the majority of it at least. So it's a myth. It's a myth that about the Indian market. I think the point about index funds is also about the costs. So actually, what Indian active managers essentially did generate a gross alpha as a whole. I mean, some of them obviously generated even a net alpha, but I'm saying as a whole, they probably generated say 2% gross alpha and spent 2% of it in fees, and they charged 2% in fees. So the net alpha was 0. So yes, they made some gross alpha, but no net alpha for you as an investor. If you believe that you can find the right managers, then that's your choice. So as I said, the recording is available. So this PPT is available in a recording form along with a voiceover, which explains each of the points. This presentation is made in a form where it doesn't really explain everything. It's bullet points for talking. So that's where the voiceover helps, and I think it's the right way to understand and see this PPT. Someone asked about mistakes. I think a lot of different kinds of mistakes. I think not diversifying was one, and I think in some case people misinterpret Buffett's view on it, or I think Buffett, whatever, and also about diversification, where Buffett said there's no need to diversify, so I'm not diversifying, but that's not actually. Buffett also said invest in index funds. So I think one has to read carefully, and if one is treating somebody's views as the gospel truth. Okay, I'll just look for any recent questions. Can you please recommend? Someone asked a question. Can you please recommend a reliable stock advisor? I think okay. And another question about the 4% rule. On the bit about can you recommend a reliable stock advisor? I assume you mean for direct stock investments. Uh, okay, so that's not anyway what I do, and that's not what I recommend to my clients. So it wouldn't be fair for me to make that statement right now. I mean, if you wanted to do it, then probably a good way to do it is find low risk mutual fund manager who you a value style probably fund manager, and bet on him. I think some of the good funds in India are on that sense are Franklin Templeton, HDFC, and Quantum Mutual Fund. And I'm not talking about specifically of returns over the last 10 years or anything like that, because actually alpha can be generated only in a 15 or 20-year horizon, and that's the right horizon to look at alpha, and that data often doesn't exist. So the email I think that the IIM Bangalore office sent out as an invitation to this webinar also has details below on how to access the recording. The next question is, okay, so there's a 4% rule someone mentioned applies in the US where there is low real inflation. Yeah, so the 4% rule applied in the US in the past. There's no guarantee it will apply in the US in the future. It failed if tested in various other countries, and basically no conservative financial planner and investment advisor like myself, I mean, who's of a similar level of conservativeness, would recommend the 4% rule. But it's, I mean, it was a path-breaking rule at its point in time, possibly, but not what anyone like me would recommend right now. There's a couple of questions about home loan. Maybe let me just give the big picture point. The big picture point is, I mean, this probably doesn't explain the whole question, but the big picture point is that you have to do an apples and apples comparison. You cannot say I put money in the stock market and versus my home loan rate of interest. You have to do an apples and apples comparison of a low risk investment, a zero risk investment essentially, versus your home loan, because you have to pay back your home loan. So that's an apples and apples comparison on a risk adjusted basis. So comparing it with a zero risk, zero credit risk investment, or zero risk investment at least, let's say, which is in this case, let's say the quantum liquid fund which I mentioned, which one of the slides will generate 6.15% post capital gains tax if you hold it for more than 3 years. Essentially learn inflation. So it's very hard for that to do better than what you're paying off to the bank for your home loan. Now you need to superimpose the tax savings that you get from the government on having a home loan. So that's a more involved calculation. But when you do it, at least for people, I mean, basically you are. It's by and large it will be best to prepay the home loan. I mean, the tax benefits the government gives you will not compensate for this 2 odd percentage point, 2-3 percentage point gap in returns. I don't want to answer the specific question of buying a second home a correct or a wise financial decision, because it's very specific to the individual. Because real estate is a very illiquid investment. So as you get into your 60s, 70s, 80s, the illiquidity of real estate is a problem, and one will have to see, does one have enough liquidity, because it takes 6 months to a year to sell real estate. So it's a tough question to answer, and it's very person specific. I think broadly real estate is something like equity in a way. So it's got some of the positives and negatives, some additional positives and some additional negatives. The positive is that you can't see the price volatility, so it doesn't scare you. The negative is that it's very illiquid. It's as risky, but it's as illiquid, and it's very undiversified. So you can't diversify your investment. So if that one property is a bad investment, then you live with it. And if it's a blockbuster, then yeah, you get the benefit of it. But that level of I mean, one can't have too much of those undiversified investments. Let me just quickly scroll through and see if there are any other questions that I can quickly answer. I think someone asked me to repeat the mutual funds, so I'm actually not recommending any mutual funds. I kind of said it because someone asked a question. I do not recommend any active mutual funds to any of my clients. I only recommend index and index-like fund, which is my style. But if there was someone insistent that they did want to go to an active manager, then I would reluctantly say, fine, go to either Franklin Templeton or HDFC or Quantum Mutual Fund. In the case of Franklin Templeton or HDFC, just pick their large cap fund or their multi cap fund. That's it. Don't touch mid caps or small caps because they're too risky and unnecessary. We already have too much risk in terms of being completely concentrated in a India portfolio. Why increase that risk further? And there's some other articles that are written about how to invest abroad, which is not relevant to most of us, but that also makes the point that we're already very concentrated in our portfolios with 100% of our net worth for most of us in India. So, then putting money into mid caps and small caps is being taking even more risk than we should be taking. So I can't answer a question of if you have 10 lakhs to invest, how much to invest it. I mean, I see it as more of an overall asset allocation for an individual. And I think the slides on that split give some idea of my thinking on it. I don't have a view on buying versus renting. I think they are broadly neutral choices. So one really needs to look at more soft factors such as, do you know that you live in the city for a long time? Do you know you live in this area for a long time? Do you have a stable job which can say that? Or, I mean, that's not a deal breaker, but that's one factor. And is it too big a part of your net worth? Do you need liquidity? So I think there are a lot of subjective factors in the decision of whether to buy or rent a house, especially in a city like Mumbai where real estate is so expensive and it can be a significant part of one's net worth. It's true everywhere, but more so in a city like Mumbai. So I think I've just mentioned a little bit about second home. I won't add any more because it's kind of a tough one to answer without any context. And to reiterate, I'm not really recommending any mutual funds. I would say that, yeah, if you're looking to invest, you can very easily invest directly online. Go to the website of the mutual fund, you can invest through that. Or you can go to the website for some mutual funds which are clients of CAMS, which is like a service provider of mutual funds. You can go to their website and invest in any of the mutual funds which are their clients, or just go directly to the mutual fund website. And that would allow you to invest in direct plans, which are, for example, if HDFC's equity fund charges you 2% a year through a distributor, it will charge you 1% a year directly. And actually, yeah, you need to then know what you're buying, but that's the quantum of difference in terms of cost. I think maybe since the questions are trickling off, I'll just wait for a couple of seconds and see if there's anything else important and then wrap up. Just in case anybody did not get the email, I guess they can write to the alumni office and get the email on how to access the recording. There's a question about gold ETFs. Not my. Actually, gold is a very tough asset class to understand. Demonetization made me realize why Indians and Chinese like gold so much. But that's physical gold. So that's a little more understandable. The gold ETFs versus gold bonds, which pay some interest, it's a separate question, difficult one to answer, because value investing will first ask me to answer what's the value of gold. And since I can't answer that question, though it's had value for thousands of years in the minds of humans, it's a very difficult question to answer. So I'm going to duck this question. But yeah, essentially because of gold bonds which pay some interest, gold ETFs have diminished a little bit in terms of attractiveness. I'm not recommending gold bonds. I'm just saying that that's a prevalent market uh, direction currently. There are gold ETFs obviously that exist, and maybe there are one benefit of them is they're more liquid than the gold bonds. So that's one reason why people hold them. Yeah, someone asked about gold. These are basically gold ETFs essentially, so the same answer applies. I'm sorry if I missed some questions earlier because I did not really carefully check all the previous questions.
Sir, there was one question like, is annual expense not subject to inflation?
Okay, sure.
Old question it is.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I've probably not been. Maybe my slides weren't clear enough. I was just using this variable z at various points in time, and that z meant different things in different slides. So yes, expenses are subject to inflation. So your expenses will increase with inflation, and broadly yes, they could increase a little more or less. The formulas are trying to do all these calculations in real numbers, so hence they've ignored inflation to some extent. It's a little difficult for me to explain the mathematics of it right now at the end of this call, but broadly that's what it is. And someone asked a quick question about PPF. Yes, I think PPF is a great investment option. Actually, there are limits on how much one can put into a PPF, so it's limited in that sense of being able to invest 1.5 lakhs per person, or in a way per adult per year. So it's a great investment option and very tax efficient. But yeah, there's only so much that one can put in it. But I think one should maximize what one puts into PPF.
So there's one more, like, I don't know whether you said this, you are already answered it. Index funds in India are not as cheap compared to US. So Warren Buffett's suggestion may not apply in Indian scenario as much as it applies to US. I think it's not a question, it's just a...
Yeah, no, I think I partially, thanks for pointing that out. I think I partially answered it. I think it's a very common view, and that's the view that everyone will say if you ask them. And then the next view will be that, oh yeah, but you can earn easy alpha in mid caps and small caps. I don't think there's data for it. Actually, it's a bit of this question of, both sides pointing to each other to say, give me data. So I think my point is, if someone says that it's easy to make alpha in India, then my point is, show me the data and show me data in a robust form. So most reports that you will see are basically, you could say, stupid reports, which don't factor in many important statistical parameters like survivorship bias, which creeps into it, style drift, looking at the correct weightages of these funds in their analysis. So you get poor quality studies which throw up interesting results, but they're not robust studies. Look at the S&P SPIVA report as a robust study, and that has been saying the same thing for the last 10 years, that there is no, at least there is no sign of alpha. Even if it cannot say that there is no alpha, they can say, look at the report and say that there is no evidence in this report of alpha, or net alpha, net of fees. Top 2 safe and efficient investments, hard to answer in a general sense, but I think let me just rewind. Let me just fast forward to a couple of, sorry about this. So these are the list of items mentioned there, and this is just an extra slide. And I think all these are decent options. I think I mentioned some alternatives to the quantum liquid fund in a different slide, in the earlier slide. So because there's a limit to how much one can put in any one instrument, one shouldn't be putting more than 10 or 15% of one's net worth in any one instrument. So there are alternatives to it. I think there are a few questions that may be hard to answer. Okay. Just testing whether the webinar is still working. I think it's working. Sushma, can you still hear me?
Yeah, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think let's wrap up then. There are a few more questions, but maybe I won't be able to provide good answers to them. So thanks everyone for your time, and thanks Sushma and Ankita for your help with organizing this, and thank you to IIM Bangalore for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Avinash, sir, for presenting this wonderful webinar to all of us. I hope all of the participants perhaps have got information, and we'll be sending the recording file to all the participants. And if you have any doubts or questions, you can mail it to alumni@imb.ac.in. We can help you out and to reach out to the presenter. Yeah. Okay.